The morning sun cast long shadows across Ramstein Air Base as Second Lieutenant Grace Parker adjusted her flight suit one final time. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, not because it was new, but because she hadn't worn one in 8 months. 8 months since her last official flight assignment. 8 months since they'd reassigned her to administrative duties after what they called the incident. Grace walked across the tarmac toward the massive C-130 Hercules, her boots echoing against the concrete. Around her, maintenance crews performed final checks while cargo handlers secured equipment in the aircraft's belly. The morning briefing had been clear. Routine transport mission to Forward Operating Base Echo. Personnel transfer. Nothing complicated. She should have known it wouldn't be that simple. "Hey, Thompson," called out Staff Sergeant Rick Daniels as he supervised the loading. "Make sure the passenger manifest is correct. We've got one extra body today." Sergeant Mike Thompson glanced at his clipboard, then at Grace approaching the aircraft. "Yeah, about that. Orders came down from Colonel Bradley himself. Said we're transporting the lieutenant to Echo Base for, what was it?" He squinted at the paperwork. "Operational assessment." Daniels snorted. "Operational assessment? What's she gonna assess? The quality of our coffee?" Grace heard every word. She'd learned to tune out the whispers, the sideways glances, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. But today felt different. Today the tension seemed thicker, more deliberate. As she approached the rear ramp of the Hercules, another voice carried over the engine noise. It was Technical Sergeant Dave Morris, one of the flight engineers. "I'm telling you, Rodriguez, this is ridiculous. We're already at max weight with the medical supplies and ammunition. Now they're adding dead weight to the manifest." "Dead weight?" Rodriguez questioned, securing a cargo net. "The lieutenant," Morris replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "She's not crew, not essential personnel, just a passenger taking up space and fuel." Grace's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She'd requested this transport herself. Insisted. On it, actually. The reports coming back from Echo Base weren't adding up. Supply shortages, morale issues, tactical concerns that didn't match the official assessments. She needed to see it with her own eyes, feel the pulse of the operation firsthand. But none of that mattered to these men. To them she was exactly what Morris had called her, dead weight. The aircraft's interior was dim and utilitarian, filled with the familiar smells of aviation fuel, metal, and that distinctive military scent of canvas and oil. Grace found her assigned seat, a fold-down bench near the rear bulkhead, isolated from the crew stations. She strapped herself in and placed her helmet on her knees, watching the final preparations. In the cockpit, Captain Jake Morrison ran through his pre-flight checklist with his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Brian Nash. Morrison was a 15-year veteran, confident and competent, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, even from behind. "Weather looks good," Nash reported, scanning his instruments. "Clear skies all the way to Echo." Morrison nodded, then caught sight of Grace in his peripheral vision through the cockpit's rear window. "Still can't believe they're making us babysit," he muttered. Nash glanced back. "Think she's even qualified to be on a military transport? I heard she hasn't flown in months." "Doesn't matter," Morrison replied, his voice carrying just enough for Grace to hear. "Orders are orders. Just make sure she doesn't touch anything important. Last thing we need is some desk jockey messing with our equipment." Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She'd heard it all before, the doubts, the assumptions, the casual dismissal of her capabilities. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know from her current assignment pushing papers in the personnel office, was what she'd done before her reassignment. The engines spun up with a familiar whine that sent vibrations through the aircraft's frame. Grace felt her body respond instinctively, the subtle shift in balance as the aircraft prepared to move, the way the sound changed as different systems came online. It had been too long since she'd felt this, but her body remembered everything. As the Hercules began its taxi toward the runway, Sergeant Daniels made one final check of the cargo area. He paused near Grace's position, ostensibly to inspect a tie-down strap. "First time on a real military flight, Lieutenant?" he asked, not quite mockingly, but close enough. Grace met his eyes steadily. "No, Sergeant," Not my first time." Something in her tone made him pause. For just a moment his casual confidence wavered, but then he shrugged and moved on, rejoining the other crew members who clustered near the forward bulkhead, pointedly excluding her from their pre-flight banter. The aircraft turned onto the runway, engines building to full power. Through the small porthole beside her, Grace watched the landscape begin to blur as they accelerated. The familiar pressure of takeoff pushed her back into her seat, and despite everything, the whispers, the isolation, the months of administrative exile, she smiled. They thought they knew her story. They thought they understood what she was capable of based on her current assignment and the rumors that followed her like shadows. But Grace Parker had secrets, and she had skills that her personnel file would never reveal. 23 minutes into the flight, when everything went wrong and the aircraft's fate hung in the balance, they would learn exactly who they'd been dismissing as just extra weight. But for now, Grace sat in silence, watching the crew who didn't know they were flying with one of the most skilled pilots in the Air Force, someone whose last official flight had ended with 7 lives saved and a career destroyed by politics and pride. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were flying into disputed airspace, carrying critical supplies to a forward base under constant threat, and they'd chosen to marginalize the one person on board who might be able to save them all. The flight had settled into routine cruising altitude when Grace first noticed the change in the crew's behavior. What had started as casual dismissal was evolving into something more pointed, more deliberate. It began with Technical Sergeant Morris making his rounds through the cargo bay. He stopped at every station, checking equipment, reviewing manifests, and engaging each crew member in brief conversations. When he reached Grace's area, he looked right through her as if she didn't exist. "Rodriguez," he called out to the loadmaster, "double-check the aft cargo straps. I want everything secure back here." Rodriguez approached, tools in hand, and began inspecting the tie-downs just 3 feet from where Grace sat. As he worked, Morris continued his commentary. "Can't be too careful with non-essential cargo," Morris said, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "Sometimes things shift during flight, create balance issues. Dead weight can be dangerous if it's not properly secured." Grace understood the message perfectly. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being actively humiliated in front of the entire crew. The military precision of it impressed her in a way that also made her stomach clench with familiar anger. From the cockpit, Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. "Morris, status report on passenger area." "All secured, Captain," Morris replied, looking directly at Grace as he spoke. "Non-essential passenger is properly restrained and won't be interfering with flight operations." "Copy that. Make sure it stays that way." The emphasis on "it" wasn't subtle. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she learned long ago that reactions only fed this kind of behavior. She kept her expression neutral, her breathing steady, but Sergeant Rodriguez seemed uncomfortable with the exchange. As Morris moved forward, Rodriguez lingered, adjusting a strap that didn't need adjusting. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you okay back here? Need anything?" It was the first human kindness anyone had shown her since boarding. Grace managed a small smile. "I'm fine, Sergeant. Thank you for asking." Rodriguez nodded and started to move away, but Grace caught his attention again. "Rodriguez, can I ask you something?" He paused, glancing toward the front of the aircraft where Morris was engaged with other crew members. "Sure, ma'am." "How long have you been flying with this crew?" "About 6 months. Why?" Grace chose her words carefully. "They seem very focused on protocols today." Rodriguez followed her gaze toward Morris, who was now in animated conversation with another crew member. "Morris has been riding everyone hard lately, ever since Captain Morrison got word about the inspection next month. Everyone's trying to look sharp, you know?" "Inspection?" "Yeah, some colonel from command is reviewing our unit's performance. Morris thinks if we can prove we run a tight ship, it might mean promotions." Rodriguez lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I think he's just looking for ways to show authority." Grace nodded, understanding more than Rodriguez realized. She'd seen this before, junior leaders overcompensating, using any available target to demonstrate their command presence. Unfortunately, she'd become that target. 20 minutes later, the situation escalated. Grace had been reviewing some paperwork from her briefcase when she heard Nash's voice from the cockpit, slightly elevated with concern. "Captain, I'm showing some irregularities in the navigation system. Nothing critical, but the GPS feed is intermittent." Morrison's response was swift and sharp. "Morris, get up here. We need someone to check the nav panel connections." Morris hurried forward, tools in hand. Grace could hear the conversation from her position, technical discussion about loose connections and backup systems. What caught her attention was Nash's growing frustration with the intermittent signals. "This doesn't make sense," Nash muttered. "The system was fine during pre-flight." Grace had seen this exact problem before. During her time as a test pilot, she'd encountered identical symptoms in 3 different aircraft. The issue wasn't mechanical. It was software-related, a known glitch in the navigation suite that required a specific reset sequence that wasn't in the standard manual. She could fix it in less than 2 minutes, but as she started to unbuckle her harness to offer assistance, Morris's voice cut through the cabin. "Hey, passenger stay seated. Captain's orders. No movement during technical operations." Grace looked up to find Morris staring at her, his expression hard. I don't care what you were doing. Sit down, stay quiet, and let the crew handle crew business." The dismissal stung, but what bothered Grace more was watching Nash struggle with a problem she could easily solve. Through the cockpit door, she could see him running through troubleshooting procedures that wouldn't address the actual issue. "Sergeant Morris," she said calmly, "I might be able to help with the navigation problem." The cabin went quiet. Every crew member turned to look at her. Morris's expression shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. "Did I stutter, Lieutenant? I said, stay seated and stay quiet. I understand your protocol, but I have experience with this specific system malfunction." "Experience?" Morris laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "What experience? Filing reports? Making coffee? You're a passenger, not aircrew." Grace felt the familiar weight of assumptions settling over the conversation. These men saw only her current assignment, her administrative role, her presence on their aircraft as an unwelcome burden. They had no idea what her experience actually encompassed. "Sergeant, if you'd just let me explain." "No." Morrison's voice came from the cockpit, final and absolute. "Morris is right. We handle our own problems. Passengers don't interfere with flight operations. That's an order." Grace settled back into her seat, frustration building in her chest. She watched Nash continue to struggle with the navigation system, trying procedures that she knew wouldn't work, while the crew around her made it clear that her input wasn't just unwelcome, it was forbidden. Rodriguez caught her eye and offered a sympathetic shrug, but he didn't speak up. The hierarchy was clear, and challenging it would have consequences for him as well. As the flight continued, Grace found herself in the uncomfortable position of possessing knowledge that could help her fellow airmen while being explicitly prohibited from sharing it. The navigation system continued to glitch intermittently, causing minor course corrections that added time and fuel consumption to their journey. But more than the technical problem, what troubled Grace was the realization that this wasn't just casual dismissal anymore. This was systematic exclusion, designed to reinforce her status as unwelcome cargo on her own Air Force's aircraft. She had no idea that in 18 minutes, when their aircraft would face a life-threatening emergency, this same crew would desperately need every bit of the experience they were now so determined to ignore. The navigation issues had been resolved, barely, but the tension in the aircraft remained thick. Nash had eventually worked through the problem using a complex workaround that took 40 minutes longer than necessary. Grace had watched in silence, knowing that her 2-minute solution remained locked away by pride and protocol. What bothered her more than the wasted time was the pattern she was beginning to recognize. This wasn't just about her being an unwelcome passenger. There was something more deliberate about the crew's behavior, something that felt orchestrated. The realization came when she overheard a conversation between Morris and another crew member, Airman First Class Jake Wilson, as they conducted a routine equipment check near her position. Morrison says the colonel specifically asked about our passenger manifest for this flight, Morris was saying, his voice low but not quite low enough. Wilson glanced toward Grace, then back to Morris. What kind of asking? The kind where he wanted to know exactly who was on board and what their qualifications were. Made some comment about making sure we maintained proper standards during transport operations. Grace's blood went cold. Colonel Bradley, the same Colonel Bradley who had signed her reassignment orders 8 months ago. Suddenly, the crew's behavior made perfect sense. They weren't just following standard protocols or showing off for an upcoming inspection. They'd been given specific guidance about how to treat her during this flight. Wilson seemed uncomfortable with the conversation. I don't know, man. She's an officer. Seems like we should show some basic respect. Morris's laugh was sharp. Officer or not, she's here because someone upstairs wants to make a point. And that point is that certain people need to learn their place. The pieces clicked together in Grace's mind like a puzzle she'd been avoiding. This wasn't a routine transport to Echo Base for operational assessment. This was a punishment detail disguised as official duty, a way to humiliate her further while maintaining plausible deniability. She thought back to her request for this transport, how unusually quick the approval had been. She'd assumed someone finally recognized the legitimacy of her concerns about Echo Base. Instead, they'd seen an opportunity to continue her professional exile in a more public, degrading way. Rodriguez appeared from the forward section, carrying a clipboard and looking troubled. As he passed Grace's position, he slowed and glanced around to make sure the other crew members were occupied. Lieutenant, he said quietly, can I ask you something? Grace nodded, grateful for any human connection in the increasingly hostile environment. What's your actual job? I mean, before this transport. Morris keeps saying you're just administrative, but... He hesitated. You knew about that nav system problem, didn't you? The way you were listening to Nash's troubleshooting, you knew. Exactly what was wrong? Grace considered her response carefully. Rodriguez seemed genuinely curious rather than hostile, but she'd learned to be cautious about revealing too much of her background. I have some technical experience, she said finally. What kind of technical experience? The kind that used to matter. Rodriguez studied her face for a moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story. Used to matter? What happened? Before Grace could respond, Morris's voice cut through the cabin. Rodriguez, what's the status on the aft cargo temperature monitoring? Rodriguez straightened. Checking now, Sergeant. He lowered his voice to Grace. We'll talk later. But Grace doubted they would. The invisible barriers around her were becoming more solid with each passing hour of the flight. What had started as casual dismissal had evolved into deliberate isolation, and now she understood it was part of a larger strategy to break down whatever remained of her military career. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. She'd endured that before. The worst part was the waste. Here she was, trapped in a flying aluminum tube with a crew facing technical challenges she could easily solve, but pride and politics prevented her from contributing anything meaningful. 20 minutes later, the pattern of exclusion became even more pronounced. Morrison announced over the intercom that they were approaching the edge of disputed airspace, an area where hostile forces had been reported in recent weeks. All crew maintain heightened awareness. Report any unusual readings or observations immediately. It was standard protocol for this type of flight path, but Grace noticed something the others missed. Through her small porthole, she could see another aircraft in the distance, a small, fast-moving dot that appeared and disappeared among the clouds. The pattern of movement was wrong for friendly aircraft, too erratic for normal patrol patterns. She debated whether to report it. After the earlier confrontations, she knew her observations wouldn't be welcome, but potential threats were different. From technical issues, this could be a matter of safety for everyone on board. Sergeant Morris, she called out. Morris turned, his expression already annoyed. What now? I think I spotted another aircraft off our starboard side. Movement. Pattern seems unusual for this airspace. Morris walked over and looked through her porthole for a few seconds. The distant aircraft had disappeared behind cloud cover. I don't see anything, he said dismissively. It was there about 30 seconds ago. Small, fast-moving, didn't follow. Normal. Listen, Lieutenant, Morris interrupted, his voice carrying to the entire crew. I know you're probably nervous flying in a real military aircraft for the first time, but let us worry about airspace monitoring. We have actual radar and trained observers for that. Several crew members chuckled at the comment about her being nervous on her first military flight. Grace felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed on. Sergeant, I'm serious. The movement pattern. Suggested? What it suggested, Morrison's voice came from the cockpit, is that you need to stay in your lane. We have instruments and procedures for threat detection. We don't need passengers creating false alarms. Grace fell silent, but she kept watching through the porthole. The aircraft didn't reappear, but something felt wrong about the encounter. Her instincts, honed by years of flight experience in challenging environments, were telling her they needed to be more cautious. But her instincts, like her technical knowledge and her offer to help, were being systematically dismissed by a crew that had been primed to see her as nothing more than unwelcome cargo. As the C-130 continued its flight toward Echo Base, Grace realized she was trapped in a situation far more dangerous than simple professional humiliation. She was flying with a crew that had been conditioned to ignore her input completely, even when that input might be critical to their survival. In 13 minutes, when hostile fire would tear through their aircraft and their normal procedures would fail catastrophically, that systematic dismissal would nearly cost them all their lives. But for now, Grace sat in enforced silence, watching the sky and hoping her growing sense of unease was wrong. The attack came without warning. One moment, Grace was watching the landscape roll by beneath them, still troubled by the unidentified aircraft she'd spotted earlier. The next moment, the world exploded. The first missile struck the right wing with a sound like the end of the world, a metallic shriek followed by a percussion wave that slammed through the aircraft's frame. Emergency alarms screamed to life as the C-130 lurched violently, throwing loose equipment across the cabin. Grace was thrown against her restraints, but her mind immediately shifted into crisis mode. Years of training kicked in as she assessed the damage. Right engine compromised, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems flickering. The aircraft was in serious trouble. In the cockpit, Morrison fought the controls as Nash struggled with rapidly failing systems. Engine 3 is gone! Hydraulic pressure critical! We're losing altitude fast! Compensating! Nash shouted back, but his voice was tight with panic. I can't hold the trim. Wait, something's wrong with... A second explosion rocked the aircraft, smaller but more precise. Shrapnel tore through the cabin, and Nash's voice cut off abruptly. Through the cockpit door, Grace could see him slumped over his controls, blood spreading across his flight suit. Nash is down! Morrison screamed. I need help up here! Now! The crew was in chaos. Morris stared at sparking electrical panels, frozen by the cascade of failures. Wilson was pressed against the bulkhead, eyes wide with terror. Rodriguez was trying to help an injured crew member who'd been struck by debris. In that moment of universal panic, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She unstrapped her harness and stood up. Hey! Morris shouted through the chaos. Sit down! You're not authorized! Morris, shut up! Grace snapped, her voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. For the first time since boarding, she let her real self show, not the quiet, dismissed passenger, but the experienced pilot who had faced emergencies far worse than this. She pushed past Morris, who was too stunned by her sudden transformation to stop her, and headed for the cockpit. Morrison was wrestling with controls that were barely responding, sweat pouring down his face as he fought to keep the aircraft level. I can help, Grace said, sliding into Nash's blood-stained seat. Morrison turned to her, his face a mixture of desperation and disbelief. You? You're not qualified to... Captain Morrison, Grace interrupted, her hands already moving across the co-pilot's instruments with practiced precision. Engine 3 is completely gone, but we still have partial power from engines 1 and 2. If we cross-feed the fuel lines and manually trim the rudder to compensate for the asymmetric thrust, we can maintain controlled flight. Morrison stared at her as she spoke, his brain trying to process what he was hearing. This wasn't the uncertain passenger who'd been dismissed and mocked for the past hour. This was someone who clearly understood exactly what was happening to their aircraft. How do you... he started to ask. Questions later, Grace cut him off. "Right now, cut power to Engine 2 manually. It's flaming out, and if it seizes while we're already compromised, we'll lose all control." For a split second, Morrison hesitated. Everything he'd been told about this passenger, every assumption he'd made, was crashing against the reality of someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. Another alarm sounded, and the aircraft's nose dipped dangerously. The decision was made for him. "Tell me what to do," he said. Grace's hands flew over the controls. "Cross-feed valve for fuel lines. There. Manual rudder trim to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. There. Now reduce power on Engine 1 to 60%. And hold steady." The aircraft's violent shaking began to settle slightly. They were still in serious trouble, but they were no longer in an uncontrolled dive. Behind them, the cabin had gone quiet except for the sound of medical aid being given to the wounded. Morris stood in the cockpit doorway, staring at Grace with an expression of complete bewilderment. "We're still losing altitude," Morrison said, his voice calmer now but still tense. "Even with the adjustments, we can't maintain cruise altitude with this much damage." Grace was already studying the terrain map. "There's an abandoned airstrip about 20 kilometers southeast, pre-positioned for emergency landings during the Iraq conflict. It's not maintained, but it should be long enough if we can get there." "How do you know about an abandoned airstrip?" Morrison asked. Grace met his eyes for the first time with complete honesty. "Because I've landed there before, during a medical evacuation that went wrong, 3 years ago." The silence in the cockpit was profound. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something that might have been shame. "You're a pilot," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "I was," Grace replied, "before Colonel Bradley decided I was too much trouble to keep in the cockpit." Morris finally found his voice. "But your assignment, you're in administration." Grace kept her eyes on the instruments as she made micro-adjustments to keep them in controlled flight. 8 months ago, I disobeyed a direct order to abort. A medical evacuation. 7 wounded soldiers were going to die if I followed protocol, so I didn't follow protocol. I got them out." She paused, checking their heading toward the emergency airstrip. "The mission was successful. Everyone survived. But I'd violated chain of command during the rescue. Colonel Bradley said it set a dangerous precedent, that junior officers can't be allowed to make tactical decisions based on their own judgment, even when lives are at stake." Morrison was silent, absorbing the implications. "So they grounded me?" Grace continued, "transferred me to administrative duties and made sure everyone knew I was an example of what happens when you step out of line. Today's flight was supposed to be another lesson in humility." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the cockpit. The woman they'd dismissed as dead weight was now the only thing standing between them and a catastrophic crash. "Can you get us down safely?" Morrison asked. Grace looked out at the approaching terrain, calculating wind speed, descent rate, and the condition of their damaged aircraft. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm going to try." "For the first time since the attack," she allowed herself a small, grim smile. "After all, someone needs to make sure you all survive to write your reports about how the non-essential passenger helped save the aircraft." The abandoned airstrip came into view through the cracked windscreen, a thin line of crumbling asphalt cutting through the desert landscape. Grace studied the approach with the calculating eye of a pilot who had made more emergency landings than she cared to remember. "It's going to be rough," she told Morrison. "The strip looks intact, but there's no way to know the surface condition until we're committed." Morrison nodded, his earlier hostility completely gone. "What do you need from me?" "Full manual control. The hydraulics are too compromised for assisted steering. When I call for flaps, you'll need to deploy them manually. The switches are going to be sluggish." Behind them, Morris had finally overcome his shock enough to be useful. "What about the cabin? Should we prepare for crash landing procedures?" Grace glanced back at him. "Yes, but don't call it a crash landing. We're making an emergency landing at an uncontrolled field. The crew needs to stay calm." Morris nodded and headed back to brief the others. For the first time since takeoff, he was looking at Grace with something approaching respect. "Rodriguez," Grace called out, "I need you to manually check the landing. Gear indicators. The electrical systems might not be reliable." Rodriguez moved quickly to comply, understanding that Grace had somehow become the person in charge of keeping them alive. As they began their approach, Grace's mind raced through everything she knew about this particular airstrip. She'd landed here during a sandstorm 3 years ago, bringing out critically wounded soldiers when no other pilot would risk the flight. The runway was shorter than standard, with a slight cross-slope that made landing tricky even under normal conditions. But she'd done it before. She could do it again. "Gear down," she announced. The landing gear deployed with a series of mechanical thuds that seemed more pronounced than usual, another system stressed by the attack. "Flaps to 20 degrees. Morrison's hands moved to comply, and Grace felt the aircraft's behavior change. As the flaps deployed partially, they were committed now. Too low and too slow to abort, flying a damaged aircraft toward a runway that might not be in condition to handle their landing. "Contact in 60 seconds, Grace announced to the cabin. "Everyone brace." The desert floor rushed up toward them. Grace could see details now, cracks in the asphalt, sand drifts across portions of the runway, abandoned equipment scattered near what had once been a control tower. 30 seconds, she called out. The aircraft crossed the threshold of the runway at exactly the right height and speed. Grace felt the familiar moment of transition as the ground effect took hold, that brief instant when an aircraft seems to float just above the surface. Then they were down. The landing was hard but controlled. The C-130's wheels hit the cracked asphalt with a jarring impact that rattled every rivet in the airframe, but they were down and rolling. Grace applied brakes carefully, feeling for the aircraft's response on the uncertain surface. They rolled to a stop about 2/3 down the runway, engines winding down to silence. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the settling, noises of cooling metal and the distant whistle of wind across the desert. Then Rodriguez's voice broke the silence. "We're alive." A cheer went up from the cabin, tired, relieved, grateful voices expressing what they all felt. They'd survived an attack that should have killed them all, thanks to the pilot they'd spent the morning dismissing as useless cargo, but Grace wasn't ready to celebrate yet. She was thinking about what came next. "Morrison," she said quietly. "We need to talk about the attack," Morrison nodded. "The aircraft you spotted earlier, that was recon, wasn't it?" "Probably. Someone knew our route, our timing, our altitude. This wasn't a random encounter." The implication hung in the air between them. Military transport flights followed carefully planned routes that were supposed to be secure. For hostile forces to intercept them with such precision suggested either remarkable intelligence gathering or inside information. Morris appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Lieutenant Parker, the crew wants to, we need to—" He struggled for words. "Apologize?" Grace suggested. Morris flushed. "Yes, ma'am. We were wrong about you, completely wrong." Grace studied his face. The hostility was gone, replaced by obvious embarrassment and what looked like genuine remorse. "You were following orders, Sergeant. I understand that." "No," Morris said firmly. "Orders or not, we treated you like dirt, and if we'd listened to you, if we'd taken your warning about that aircraft seriously, maybe we could have avoided the attack entirely." Grace had been thinking the same thing, but she appreciated Morris acknowledging it. "What matters now is getting everyone home safely," she said. "We need to establish communications and arrange for rescue." Rodriguez appeared behind Morris. "Ma'am, we've got a problem with the radio. The attack damaged our long-range communications. We can't reach base." Grace wasn't surprised. Nothing about this situation was going to be simple. "What about emergency beacons?" "Working, but they'll only give our location. No voice communication." Grace thought for a moment. "How much water and rations do we have?" "Enough for maybe 2 days if we're careful." "Then we wait. The beacon will bring rescue, but it might take time. Our job now is to stay alive and figure out how we ended up flying into an ambush." Morrison looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. You think someone set us up? Grace met his eyes. Captain, in my experience, when someone goes to great lengths to humiliate and isolate a pilot, and then that pilot ends up on a flight that gets ambushed in supposedly secure airspace. She let the sentence hang. You think this was about you? I think this was about sending a message. The question is whether the message was supposed to be delivered to me or about me. As the implications of her words sank in, Grace began to formulate a plan. She'd been grounded, humiliated, and nearly killed, but she was still alive, and she had skills that certain people had tried very hard to neutralize. Maybe it was time to stop letting other people control her story. Maybe it was time to fight back. The rescue helicopters arrived 18 hours later, appearing as distant specks against the morning sky. Grace stood beside the damaged Hercules, watching the approaching aircraft with mixed feelings. Rescue meant safety, but it also meant returning to a system that had tried to destroy her. As the lead Black Hawk touched down, kicking up clouds of sand, Grace recognized the figure who stepped out first, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the base commander. This wasn't routine rescue protocol. Commanders didn't personally respond to emergency landings unless something significant was at stake. General Hayes approached with quick, purposeful strides, her expression unreadable. Behind her came a small team that included a flight surgeon, an intelligence officer, and someone Grace didn't recognize in civilian clothes. Lieutenant Parker, General Hayes said, stopping directly in front of Grace. I understand you've had quite an eventful flight. Yes, ma'am. The crew performed admirably under difficult circumstances. Hayes studied Grace's face for a moment. From what I'm hearing on preliminary reports, the crew might not have survived without your intervention. Grace remained silent. She'd learned to be careful about how much she said in official conversations. Captain Morrison has requested to speak with you privately, Hayes continued. He's filed some interesting preliminary statements about today's events. 30 minutes later, Grace found herself in the makeshift command post that had been established near the landing site. Morrison sat across from her, with General Hayes and the intelligence officer, Major David Chen, flanking them. Lieutenant Parker, Hayes began, I want you to walk me through yesterday's events from the beginning. Leave nothing out. Grace recounted the flight chronologically, the crew's hostile behavior, the navigation problems she'd offered to fix, the unidentified aircraft, the attack, and the emergency landing. She spoke in precise military language, sticking to facts and avoiding editorial comments. When she finished, Hayes exchanged glances with Major Chen. Lieutenant, are you aware that your transport yesterday was specifically requested by Colonel Bradley? Grace felt her stomach tighten. No, ma'am. I was told it was routine transport to Echo Base for operational assessment. There was no operational assessment scheduled, Hayes said quietly. Your name was added to the manifest at Colonel Bradley's direct request, with specific instructions about how you were to be treated during the flight. The pieces were clicking together, but Grace wanted to hear it stated explicitly. What kind of instructions, ma'am? Major Chen opened a folder. According to Captain Morrison's statement, the crew was briefed that you were being transported as a disciplinary measure. They were told to ensure you understood your reduced status within the unit. Morrison spoke up, his voice heavy with regret. We were told you were a problem officer who needed to be reminded of proper military hierarchy. Colonel Bradley made it clear that any cooperation or assistance from you should be discouraged. Grace absorbed this information calmly, though inside she felt a cold fury building. And the flight route, ma'am? Through disputed airspace? Hayes and Chen exchanged another look. That's where things get interesting, Lieutenant. The original flight plan filed by Colonel Bradley's office showed a different route, one that avoided known threat areas entirely. Major Chen pulled out a map. But the route actually flown yesterday took you directly through a corridor where hostile forces have been active for the past month. Someone changed the flight plan after it was filed. Someone with access to classified routing information, Hayes added. Someone who would have known exactly when and where to position hostile forces for an intercept. The implications were staggering. Grace had suspected the attack was too precise to be coincidental, but the reality was worse than she'd imagined. "General Hayes," Grace said carefully, "are you suggesting that Colonel Bradley deliberately sent us into an ambush?" "I'm suggesting that we have a lot of questions that need answers," Hayes replied. "And I'm also suggesting that you might have been the target of more than just professional humiliation." Morrison leaned forward. "Lieutenant, there's something else. After we landed yesterday, I had time to think about the timing of everything. The navigation problems, the crew briefing, the changed route. It's like someone wanted to make sure you were isolated and helpless when the attack came." Grace felt the pieces of a larger picture forming. "Someone wanted me discredited and dead. Or," Major Chen said quietly, "someone wanted to test whether you really had the skills your record suggests." Perhaps this was an elaborate evaluation disguised as punishment. Hayes held up a hand. "Speculation isn't helpful right now. What's helpful is evidence. Lieutenant Parker, I want you to know that as of this morning, Colonel Bradley has been relieved of duty pending a full investigation into yesterday's events." Grace blinked, not sure she'd heard correctly. "Ma'am?" "The preliminary investigation has already uncovered irregularities in the flight planning, unauthorized communications with hostile forces in the area, and evidence of systematic harassment of military personnel, specifically you." Hayes pulled out an official document. "Effective immediately, you're being reinstated to full flight status. Your administrative assignment is terminated, and you're being transferred to my direct command while this investigation proceeds." Grace stared at the reinstatement order, hardly believing what she was seeing. 8 months of exile, humiliation, and systematic destruction of her career, and now because she'd refused to die quietly, the truth was finally coming to light. "There's more," Hayes continued. "We've discovered that Colonel Bradley has been targeting several other personnel who challenged his authority or decision-making. You weren't his only victim, Lieutenant. You were just the most persistent." Morrison stood up. "General, I want to state for the record that Lieutenant Parker saved our lives yesterday, not just from the attack but from our own stupidity. We nearly got everyone killed because we were too proud and too stupid to listen to someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. Your statement is already on record, Captain, and it's being reviewed by several very interested parties in Washington." Grace felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. She'd fought this battle for so long that the sudden reversal felt almost surreal. "What happens now, ma'am?" General Hayes smiled, the first genuine smile Grace had seen from a superior officer in months. "Now, Lieutenant, you get back to doing what you do best. We have a squadron that needs experienced pilots, and apparently we've been wasting one. Of our best on paperwork," Major Chen added. "And Lieutenant, your warning about the unidentified aircraft yesterday, it probably saved lives. If you hadn't spotted that reconnaissance flight, the attack would have caught us completely unprepared." As Grace left the command post an hour later, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 months. Hope. The system that had tried to break her was finally working in her favor. Colonel Bradley's carefully constructed campaign of professional destruction was collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance and illegality. But more than that, Grace realized she'd proven something important, not just to the Air Force, but to herself. They could ground her, humiliate her, and try to kill her, but they couldn't take away who she was at her core. She was a pilot. She was good at it, and no amount of politics or punishment could change that fundamental truth. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, Grace Parker felt like she might actually win. 3 weeks later, Grace stood outside the conference room at Air Force headquarters, adjusting her dress uniform one final time. Through the frosted glass doors, she could see the silhouettes of the investigating panel. 5 senior officers, who would determine not just the fate of Colonel Bradley, but the future of her own career. General Hayes appeared beside her, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Ready for this, Lieutenant?" Grace nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Remember, just stick to the facts. The evidence speaks for itself." The doors opened and Grace stepped into a room that would change everything. The panel was impressive. 2 brigadier generals, a colonel from the Inspector General's office, a representative from Air Force Intelligence, and a stern-faced woman in civilian clothes who Grace assumed was from the Department of Defense. At the far end of the room, Colonel Bradley sat at a small table with his legal counsel, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Lieutenant Parker," the lead investigator, Brigadier General Robert Martinez, began, "thank you for appearing before this panel. Before we begin, I want you to understand that your testimony today is being recorded and will become part of the permanent record of this investigation." "I understand, sir." "Let's start with the events of 8 months ago, the incident that led to your reassignment to administrative duties." Grace had rehearsed this moment countless times, but actually speaking the words felt different. She described the medical evacuation mission, the wounded soldiers, the direct order to abort that she had chosen to disobey, and the successful rescue that followed. "In your opinion, Lieutenant, was disobeying that order the correct decision?" Grace met General Martinez's eyes directly. "Sir, 7 soldiers would have died if I had followed the abort order. In my judgment, the risk to the aircraft and crew was acceptable compared to the certainty that those men would die without immediate evacuation. And you understand that military discipline requires following orders, even when individual judgment might suggest otherwise?" "Yes, sir. I also understand that military officers are expected to exercise judgment when circumstances require it. The safety of American soldiers was at stake." Colonel Bradley's attorney leaned forward. "General Martinez, if I may? Lieutenant Parker's decision to violate direct orders set a dangerous precedent. Junior officers cannot be allowed to substitute their judgment for established command authority." General Martinez turned to Bradley. "Colonel, you were Lieutenant Parker's commanding officer at the time. Explain your decision to pursue disciplinary action." Bradley stood, his bearing still military precise despite the circumstances. "General, Lieutenant Parker repeatedly demonstrated insubordination and poor judgment. The medical evacuation incident was simply the final example of a pattern of behavior that made her unsuitable for command responsibility." "What other examples of this pattern?" Bradley opened his own folder. "Multiple instances of questioning orders, informal complaints about mission planning, and attempts to circumvent established protocols." Grace felt her anger rising, but she kept her expression neutral. Everything Bradley was describing had been her attempts to improve safety and effectiveness, suggestions that had been dismissed because they came from a junior officer who happened to be female. General Martinez turned back to Grace. "Lieutenant, how do you respond to these characterizations?" "Sir, I believe Colonel Bradley viewed any input from subordinates as insubordination, particularly from female officers. My suggestions were based on technical expertise and operational experience, not personal disagreement with command authority." "That's a serious accusation, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir. It's also demonstrably true." The intelligence representative, Colonel Sarah Anderson, spoke for the first time. "Lieutenant Parker, let's move to the events of 3 weeks ago. Describe your experience during the transport flight to Echo Base." Grace recounted the systematic humiliation, the deliberate isolation, the crew's instructions to treat her as disciplinary cargo. As she spoke, she could see the panel members exchanging glances. "And you believe this treatment was specifically ordered by Colonel Bradley?" "The crew stated as much, ma'am. They were told I was being transported as a disciplinary measure, and that any cooperation with me should be discouraged." Colonel Anderson turned to Bradley. "Colonel, did you give such instructions?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "I instructed the crew to maintain proper military discipline during transport operations. Lieutenant Parker had a history of overstepping boundaries." "By overstepping boundaries, you mean offering technical assistance when aircraft systems were failing?" "I mean interfering with crew operations beyond her assigned role as passenger." General Martinez leaned forward. "Colonel, let's discuss the flight route. The original plan filed by your office avoided known threat areas, but the actual route flown took the aircraft directly through hostile territory. Can you explain that discrepancy?" For the first time, Bradley hesitated. Flight routes are often modified based on operational requirements and current intelligence. "Whose authorization was required for such modifications?" "Mine, sir." "And Did you authorize the route change? Another hesitation. The change was made to accommodate tactical considerations. Colonel Anderson opened her own folder. Colonel Bradley, we've analyzed the communications logs from your office during the 48 hours prior to Lieutenant Parker's flight. You had 3 encrypted communications with personnel in the area where the attack occurred. The room went completely silent. Grace felt her heart racing as she realized what was being implied. Those communications were routine operational updates, Bradley said, but his voice lacked conviction. Routine updates that included specific details about aircraft type, crew composition, and flight timing. Bradley's attorney stood up. General, Martinez, I need to consult with my client. Sit down, counselor, we're not finished. General Martinez fixed Bradley with a stare that could have melted steel. Colonel, did you deliberately compromise the safety of that aircraft and its crew in order to target Lieutenant Parker? The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Grace found herself holding her breath, waiting for an answer that would determine whether her months of suffering had been the result of simple prejudice or something far worse. Bradley's composure finally cracked. That aircraft was never supposed to be shot down. It was supposed to be intercepted, forced to land, crew taken prisoner temporarily. Parker was supposed to fail under pressure, prove she couldn't handle real crisis situations. The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Even his attorney looked stunned. You arranged for the aircraft to be attacked? General Martinez's voice was deadly quiet. Intercepted, not attacked. The hostile forces were supposed to force them down, not shoot them down. It was meant to be a controlled demonstration of Parker's limitations under stress. Grace felt the world tilt around her. Everything she'd suspected was true, but hearing it confirmed was still staggering. Colonel Bradley, General Martinez said, his voice now carrying the full weight of military authority, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy to commit, murder, and violation of multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. As military police moved to escort Bradley from the room, he turned to Grace with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. You were supposed to break, he said. You were supposed to fail and disappear quietly. Instead, He shook his head. You saved them all. Grace met his eyes one final time. I did my job, Colonel. It's a shame you forgot how to do yours. As Bradley was led away, General Martinez turned back to Grace. Lieutenant Parker, on behalf of the United States Air Force, I want to apologize for the injustices you've endured. Your service record is being corrected, your commendations are being restored, and you're being promoted to captain, effective, immediately. Grace felt tears she'd been holding back for months, finally threatening to surface. Thank you, sir. No, Captain Parker, thank you. Your courage and skill saved lives, and your persistence exposed a dangerous corruption within our own ranks. The Air Force is better because of officers like you. As the panel dismissed and Grace walked out of the conference room, she realized that she'd done more than clear her name. She'd proven that sometimes the right thing to do is exactly what you're told not to do, and sometimes the system works, if you refuse to let it break you first. 6 months later, Captain Grace Parker stood on the flight line at Ramstein Air Base, watching her students practice emergency procedures in the flight simulator. As the new chief instructor for advanced pilot training, she'd built a program focused on crisis decision-making and non-standard problem-solving, skills that had once been dismissed as insubordination. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, reminding her of that morning 8 months ago when she'd boarded a Hercules as unwelcome cargo and landed as something entirely different. A familiar voice called out behind her. Captain Parker? She turned to find Rodriguez approaching, now wearing sergeant's stripes and a wide smile. Behind him walked Morrison, recently promoted to major, and even Morris, who looked slightly embarrassed but determined. Gentlemen, Grace said, returning Morrison's salute, what brings you to the training wing? Morrison stepped forward. Actually, ma'am, we're here to ask you something. The 3 of us have been talking, and we'd like to request transfer to your training program. Grace raised an eyebrow. All of you? Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. Ma'am, what we learned from you during that emergency about listening, about recognizing expertise regardless of rank or assumptions, we want to learn more. We want to be better." Morris cleared his throat. "Captain, I need to say something. What we did to you on that flight, the way we treated you, it was inexcusable. I've been thinking about it every day since." "Sergeant Morris—" "No, ma'am. Please let me finish. You saved our lives, but more than that, you showed us what real leadership looks like. When everything fell apart, you didn't waste time on blame or 'I told you so.' You just did what needed to be done." Morrison added, "We want to learn how to be that kind of leader, how to see people for who they really are instead of what we assume they are." Grace studied their faces, seeing genuine remorse and determination. These were the same men who had dismissed her as dead weight, who had followed orders to humiliate and isolate her. But they were also the men who had helped her save that aircraft once they understood who she really was. "The training program is demanding," she said. "It focuses on decision-making under pressure, crisis leadership, and what I call adaptive thinking, the ability to recognize when standard procedures aren't enough." "We understand, ma'am," Rodriguez said. "We're ready." Grace smiled. "Report to Classroom 3 tomorrow at 0600. Bring notebooks and an open mind." As the three men left, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Colonel Bradley was serving a 20-year sentence in military prison for treason and conspiracy. The investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond her case, leading to multiple arrests and a complete overhaul of several command structures. But more importantly, the Air Force had begun implementing changes based on her experience. New protocols for reporting harassment, better protection for whistleblowers, and mandatory training on recognizing and utilizing the full potential of all personnel regardless of gender, rank, or background. Her phone buzzed with a text message from General Hayes. "Grace, wanted you to know. Your emergency landing techniques are now being taught at the Air Force Academy. Official curriculum as of next semester. Your legacy is literally taking flight." Grace smiled, pocketing the phone. Legacy was a powerful word, but she preferred to think of it as possibility. Every student she trained, every pilot who learned to value competence over assumptions, every officer who chose to listen rather than dismiss, they were all part of a larger change. A young lieutenant approached from the direction of the simulator building. "Captain Parker, I'm Lieutenant Jessica Chen, reporting for advanced training." Grace recognized the name from the roster, top of her class at the academy, but facing resistance from some of the older instructors who thought she was too aggressive for a female pilot. "Welcome to the program, Lieutenant. Tell me, what do you hope to learn here?" Chen stood straighter. "Ma'am, I want to learn how to be taken seriously as a pilot, not just as a female pilot. I want to learn how to prove myself without having to crash-land a transport plane." Grace laughed, appreciating both the ambition and the reference. "Good answer. But let me tell you something, Lieutenant. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone except yourself. What you need to learn is how to be so undeniably competent that other people's assumptions become irrelevant." "How do I do that, ma'am?" Grace looked out at the flight line, where aircraft sat ready for the next mission, the next emergency, the next test of human skill and courage. "You learn everything you can. You practice until excellence becomes instinct. You help others whenever possible, even when they don't think they need your help. And when the moment comes, when everything falls apart and people are counting on you, you do your job with such precision and grace that no one can ever again question whether you belong in that cockpit." Chen nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "And Lieutenant," Grace added, "remember that sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones where you defeat an enemy. Sometimes they're the ones where you change minds, open doors, and make it easier for the person coming behind you." As the sun set over Ramstein Air Base, Grace walked back toward the training building, thinking about the students she would teach tomorrow, the pilots they would become, and the crises they would face with skills and confidence she had helped instill. She had started as unwelcome cargo on a military transport. She had endured systematic humiliation, survived an assassination attempt disguised as punishment, and fought back against corruption at the highest levels. But her greatest victory wasn't any of those things. Her greatest victory was standing. Here now, 6 months later, in a position to ensure that no other talented pilot would have to crash land a transport plane just to prove they belonged in the sky. The little girl who had dreamed of flying had grown up to become not just a pilot, but a guardian of other dreamers. And in the end, that legacy would soar higher and last longer than any individual flight. The flight line grew quiet as the day shift ended, but Grace could almost hear the promise of tomorrow. New students, new challenges, new opportunities to turn assumptions into respect and potential into reality. She had found her purpose, not just in the cockpit, but in ensuring that excellence would always find a way to rise above prejudice. The sky, after all, belonged to everyone brave enough to claim it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become
a part of our Everyday Life Stories community.
Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. What would you have done in Grace's situation? Have you ever had to prove yourself when others doubted your abilities? Share your own inspiring stories in the comments. Your experiences might just inspire our next incredible story.